Look, I don't think anybody needs me to rehash the Sophie Cunningham story. Obviously, the Fever trade for her in the offseason. She has that moment with J.C. Sheldon in that Sun game, protecting Caitlin Clark or enforcing laying down the law, if you will, that leads to just an explosion in popularity because she came off like such a badass, and obviously because, well, she is a badass, and because people were desperate or yearning for someone to step up for Caitlin Clark in that way. And there is the popularity that comes from the proximity of being around Caitlin Clark and playing for the Indiana Fever.
Sometimes the biggest stories don't break with press releases or watch bombs. Sometimes they slip out quietly, disguised as a joke, a casual line, something that wasn't supposed to mean anything. And that's exactly why this moment sent the WNBA internet into a full meltdown. Because one sentence changed everything. No announcement, no contract news, just an offhand comment that immediately had fans asking the same question: did Sophie Cunningham just accidentally reveal her future? The timing couldn't be more perfect or more suspicious. Cunningham became a household name almost overnight after stepping up for Caitlin Clark, delivering the kind of fearless, no-nonsense energy fans had been begging to see. That moment didn't just go viral, it turned her into a symbol, an enforcer, a ride-or-die teammate in a league where toughness suddenly mattered again. Since then, her popularity has exploded, fueled by the Caitlin Clark spotlight and her natural fit with the Indiana Fever. But there's always been one problem hanging over the whole story: free agency. Sophie hasn't been under contract. She's openly talked about knowing her worth. She's hinted at testing the market. And for months, fans have been stuck in limbo. That's why this comment hit so hard. It didn't sound like hope. It didn't sound like speculation. It sounded like assumption, like something already decided. And when millions of people hear the same sentence and reach the same conclusion at the same time, it's not random. Nothing is official, no deals have been announced, but the silence is loud and the clues are starting to stack up. So the real question is what was said. It's why it sounded like something that wasn't supposed to be said at all. This story really starts with one split second that changed how fans viewed Sophie Cunningham forever. Not a box score, not a stat line, a reaction, an instinctive move that felt raw, unfiltered, and impossible to fake. The kind of moment that tells you exactly who someone is under pressure. When Caitlin Clark took contact in that Sun game and the temperature on the court spiked, most players hesitated. Sophie didn't. There was no pause, no looking at the refs, no calculating the consequences. She stepped in immediately, setting a boundary that said everything fans had been waiting to see. That wasn't basketball, it was a message. And the league felt it. Clips spread everywhere within minutes, not because of a fight, but because of what it represented. Fans weren't reacting to violence. They were reacting to protection, to loyalty, to someone finally stepping up when it felt like Clark was being targeted without consequences. In a league that often talks about toughness but rarely shows it in moments like that, Sophie's response landed like lightning. That's when the narrative shifted. Overnight, she wasn't just another role player. She became that one, the enforcer, the teammate you want next to you when things get ugly. Social media ran with it, but it wasn't forced hype. It felt earned. Fans had been begging for someone, anyone, to draw a line, and Sophie did it without hesitation. What made the moment even more powerful was that it didn't feel rehearsed. This wasn't branding, this wasn't media training, it was instinct, and fans can smell authenticity from a mile away. That's why it stuck. From that point on, everything around her changed. Her name started popping up in conversations it never had before. Highlights of her plays, screens, hustle, defensive stops started getting extra attention, not because she suddenly became a different player, but because people were finally watching closely. And yes, proximity mattered. Playing next to Caitlin Clark put a magnifying glass on everyone around her, but not everyone benefited the same way. Sophie didn't disappear into the background. She stood out. She fit the moment. She leaned into the role without forcing it. That's rare. What fans responded to wasn't just toughness. It was clarity, She knew exactly who she was on that floor: a competitor, a protector, someone willing to absorb heat so the star didn't have to. That kind of role becomes invaluable fast, especially on a young team trying to establish an identity. By the time the dust settled, Sophie Cunningham wasn't just popular. She was necessary to the fanbase, to the culture of the team, to the story people wanted to believe in. And once that happens, free agency stops being a routine business decision. It becomes personal, because now fans aren't just asking if she'll return. They're asking how the team could possibly let her walk away. But that was only the beginning. There's a reason this story doesn't work without talking about Caitlin Clark, because whether people want to admit it or not, she is the gravitational force pulling everything into focus. Playing next to Clark isn't just playing basketball, it's performing under a microscope that never turns off. Every possession gets clipped, every interaction gets analyzed, every teammate gets judged, not just on skill, but on chemistry, and that spotlight can crush players who aren't ready for it. We've seen it happen before, but Sophie Cunningham didn't fold under that pressure, she thrived in it. What makes that important is this: proximity alone doesn't guarantee popularity. Plenty of players share the floor with stars and remain invisible. Sophie didn't. She carved out a clear role almost immediately, not as a sidekick, not as background noise, but as a complement, someone whose energy balanced Clark's game rather than competing with it. Fans picked up on that fast. The Fever weren't just building lineups, they were building a narrative. Aaliyah Boston as the anchor, Kelsey Mitchell as the scorer, Clark as the engine, and Sophie, she became the edge, the attitude, the one willing to do the uncomfortable stuff that doesn't always show up in highlights but changes how teams play against you. That's where the Caitlin Clark effect works differently. It doesn't just elevate stats, it magnifies personalities. And Sophie's personality translated perfectly to a fanbase that was already emotionally invested in protecting its star. When you stand next to someone everyone feels protective over, your actions carry more weight. And Sophie used that weight wisely. She didn't chase the spotlight. She reacted naturally within it. Tough defense, physical screens, talking back when needed, standing her ground. Those things hit harder when millions are watching, and they hit even harder when fans already feel like the league hasn't done enough to protect Clark. That's why Sophie's popularity didn't feel manufactured. It felt organic, earned, like someone stepping into a role the moment demanded. And the Fever benefited from that synergy. You could feel it in the building. The team had an identity forming, not just young and talented, but gritty, unapologetic, willing to push back. Sophie became part of that image, whether the front office planned it or not. Which is exactly why her free agency became such a nerve-wracking topic. Because once a player becomes woven into the identity of the team, letting her walk isn't just a roster move. It's a cultural decision. Fans don't just see a name on a transaction wire. They see a whole, a message, sometimes even a betrayal. And Sophie knew that too. She understood the leverage that came with being valuable on the court and beloved off it. And she wasn't shy about acknowledging her worth. Not in a flashy way, not with drama, just honest statements about wanting security and being smart about her future. That's when this story stopped being about basketball fit and started becoming about timing. Because when popularity, chemistry, and market value all peak at once, every word starts to matter. And the off-season silence made fans hyper-aware of every hint, every post, every comment. Which is why what came next felt less like speculation and more like something slipping out before it was supposed to. Once the season ended, the story around Sophie Cunningham quietly shifted. The viral moments were still circulating. The fan love hadn't cooled off. But now there was a different conversation happening in the background, one that makes fans uncomfortable, but players can't afford to ignore: free agency. And Sophie didn't tiptoe around it. She made it clear in her own blunt way that she understood her position, that she was a dumb blonde, that she was going to look at what was out there, that she wanted a bigger contract, more security and stability in her life. Not headlines, not drama, just honesty. In most leagues, that would be standard. In the WNBA, it landed differently. Some fans immediately got defensive. They worried the comments meant she was halfway out the door. Others brushed it off as leverage talk, exactly what players are supposed to do when their value rises. And then there was a third group who quietly admitted the obvious: she'd earned the right to ask. Because Sophie wasn't just riding a wave, she contributed, she fit, she played multiple positions, she shot the ball, she defended, she embraced the role nobody else seemed eager to claim, and she did it while absorbing attention that comes with sharing the floor with Caitlin Clark. That matters. The uncomfortable truth is that popularity doesn't always translate to contracts in this league. Visibility doesn't guarantee security, and players know that the window to cash in, relatively speaking, is small. Sophie acknowledging that out loud wasn't selfish, it was realistic. What made it more interesting was how carefully she balanced it. She never trashed the team, never distanced herself from the Indiana fever, never hinted at locker room issues. In fact, she kept talking about the fever, the chemistry, and Caitlin Clark regularly, especially on her podcast. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed. If she was truly looking to leave, why stay so connected to the fanbase? If she was preparing to move on, why keep the door emotionally open? That tension is what made the off-season feel so charged. Fans weren't just waiting for news. They were reading tone, looking for subtext, watching body language, and every time Sophie spoke, it felt like she was saying just enough to keep both options alive. Which is smart. From her perspective, this wasn't just about finding a team. It was about timing the market, understanding her leverage, knowing that her name carried more weight now than it ever had before. And in a league where contracts are tight and careers are short, that awareness matters. Still, the uncertainty lingered. Free agency stretched on, no announcements, no confirmation, just silence and speculation filling the gaps. And then, in the middle of all that tension, something unexpected happened. Not a tweet, not a report, not a front office leak. Just a sentence. Spoken casually, almost carelessly. The kind of sentence that only hits hard if it reveals something people weren't supposed to hear yet. And once fans heard it, there was no unhearing it. The reason this moment hit so hard is simple. It didn't sound like speculation. It didn't sound like hope. It sounded like assumption. And in sports, that distinction changes everything. The setting couldn't have been more casual. Sophie Cunningham was recording her podcast, Show Me Something, talking through off-season life, the fever, and the league in the same relaxed tone she always uses. Nothing felt staged. Nothing felt dramatic. Then the conversation drifted, and that's when the unexpected guest entered the picture. Meredith Marks, best known for Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, wasn't a basketball insider. She wasn't a reporter. She wasn't someone fans expected to drop news, which is exactly why what she said landed the way it did. Mid-conversation, Marks casually turned to Sophie and said, "We need to get you to a fever game. Not if, not hopefully, not someday. We need to get you to a fever game." That wording matters. It wasn't framed like a wish or a fan's hope. It sounded like someone talking about logistics, like someone assuming the destination was already locked in, and fans caught it instantly. Social media lit up within minutes. Clips spread. Comments flooded in. People replayed the line over and over, trying to decide whether they were overthinking it or whether they'd just heard something they weren't supposed to hear yet. Why would someone say that to a free agent unless they believed she'd be back? Why say it so confidently unless that return was already expected? Now, to be clear, nothing official was announced. No contracts were signed on air, and even the podcast host downplayed it afterward, calling it an offhand comment. But that explanation didn't sit right with fans, because offhand comments don't usually land with that much certainty. And context made it louder. This wasn't a random stranger. This was someone speaking directly to Sophie in a setting where the guard was down. There were no cameras, no press credentials, just conversation. That's exactly when leaks happen, not through reporters, but through people who assume something is already common knowledge. Fans started connecting dots, the Fever's silence, Sophie's continued engagement with team content, her chemistry with Caitlin Clark and Lexi Hull, the holiday posts, the lack of distancing language, all of it suddenly felt less coincidental. What made this moment feel different from typical off-season chatter was how little it tried to be anything at all. No build-up, no drama, just a sentence that slipped out naturally. And that's what convinced people. Not that it was planned, but that it was honest. Because when people believe something is already decided, they speak differently, they stop hedging, they stop qualifying, they talk in terms of when, not if. That's why this comment didn't fade, it stuck. It replayed, it echoed. And once fans started believing it wasn't a guess, the question stopped being could Sophie return? It became, was this the moment the secret accidentally got out? Once that podcast line was out in the wild, fans didn't just react emotionally, they went into detective mode. Because when something feels real, people start looking backward for confirmation. And suddenly, moments that once felt harmless started looking intentional. The first thing everyone pointed to was the Indiana Fever themselves. During a period when teams usually go quiet about unsigned players, the Fever didn't exactly create distance from Sophie Cunningham. In fact, they did the opposite. Around the holidays, the team posted a festive image that prominently featured Sophie alongside Lexi Hull, not buried in a collage, not cropped out, but front and center. For a free agent, that's unusual. For a free agent who might be leaving, even more so. Fans immediately clocked it. Teams are careful during free agency. Every post is intentional. Every image is reviewed. So when Sophie appeared in core team imagery, supporters didn't see a coincidence. They saw a message, a soft signal that she still belonged, that she was still part of the plan. Then there was the chemistry angle, which only got stronger the more people looked at it. On the court, Sophie fit seamlessly next to Caitlin Clark. Off the court, the bond was just as visible. Interviews, bench reactions, even casual moments, like Sophie and Lexi acting as caddies for Clark during a golf outing, felt like something more than teammates killing time. That stuff matters. Front offices talk endlessly about fit, but fans recognize it instantly when they see it. Sophie didn't feel like a temporary piece. She felt integrated, comfortable, trusted, and that kind of chemistry is hard to manufacture, especially on a young team still finding its identity. Basketball-wise, the argument only got stronger. Sophie wasn't just a viral personality, she was a real contributor. She defended multiple positions, she shot when needed, she handled physical matchups others didn't want. Even her late-season injury didn't erase the impact she'd already made. Coaches trusted her, teammates leaned on her. When you stack all of that together, the fit, the chemistry, the visibility, the fan attachment, it becomes harder to imagine the Fever willingly walking away. And that's the key difference here. This doesn't feel like fans begging for something unrealistic. It feels like fans recognizing alignment. The kind of alignment teams usually try to lock in, not let slip away. Especially when the player in question has become part of the team's emotional identity as well as its on-court rotation. That's why the podcast comment didn't feel like a random slip. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle fans had already been assembling for weeks. Nothing official has been announced. Contracts still matter, money still matters, but from the outside looking in, the signals all point the same direction. And when a team's actions quietly line up with a player's presence, fans tend to trust what they see more than what they're told. Which leads to the question no one can avoid anymore. If all the signs say she's staying, what's left to decide? At this point, the conversation stops being about one sentence on a podcast and starts being about inevitability. Because when you strip away the hype, the speculation, and the fan emotion, what's left is a simple question. Does it actually make sense for the Indiana Fever to let Sophie Cunningham walk away? And the answer most fans land on is no. Not just because she's popular, not just because she went viral, but because of what she represents to this specific team at this specific moment. The Fever aren't just rebuilding a roster, they're building an identity, and identities don't survive constant turnover. With Caitlin Clark as the engine of the franchise, the team needs stability around her, not just talent, but trust. Players who understand the pressure that comes with the spotlight. Players willing to absorb physicality, noise, and attention so the star doesn't have to do it alone. Sophie proved she could be that person. That's why this situation feels different from typical free agency drama. Normally, fans argue from emotion while front offices argue from numbers. Here, those two things overlap. Sophie fits the rotation, she fits the locker room, she fits the fanbase, and she fits the narrative the Fever are unintentionally becoming, a team that isn't backing down. Letting her leave would send a message, whether the organization intends it or not. It would say that viral moments don't matter, that chemistry is replaceable, that protection and edge are optional. And for a fanbase that has already been hypersensitive about how Caitlin Clark is treated league-wide, that message wouldn't land well. From a business standpoint, it's just as risky. Sophie's popularity didn't exist in a vacuum. She brought in new eyes, new engagement, new conversation. In a league where every ounce of attention counts, letting a fan favorite walk, especially one so tightly linked to your star, feels counterproductive. That's why fans keep circling back to the idea that this isn't unfinished business, it's delayed business. The money still has to be right, the contract still has to make sense. Sophie was clear about wanting security, and that matters, but nothing about her public behavior suggests she's preparing for a clean break. If anything, she's stayed unusually connected, emotionally and publicly, to the Fever. And that's where the leak theory gains traction. Not because Meredith Marks is an insider, not because someone spilled numbers, but because people don't speak casually about futures they think are uncertain. They speak casually about plans they believe are already forming. Fans recognize that tone instinctively. It's why the reaction wasn't confusion, it was excitement, relief, a feeling that something they'd been hoping for was finally lining up. So while nothing has been signed yet, this moment feels less like speculation and more like confirmation waiting for paperwork. And in sports, when everything points in one direction, announcements tend to follow, not surprises. Which makes this less about if Sophie Cunningham returns, and more about when the Fever decide to make it official. By now, the speculation isn't being driven by rumor accounts or hot take culture. It's being driven by pattern recognition. Fans have watched enough free agency cycles to know what uncertainty looks like, and this doesn't feel like it. What makes this situation stand out is how calm it feels beneath the noise. There's no distancing language, no thank you for everything posts, no subtle goodbyes wrapped in nostalgia. Instead, Sophie Cunningham has remained present, engaged, comfortable. That's not how players usually act when they're mentally preparing to move on. Look at how she's spoken publicly. When athletes are leaving, their words start to shift. They get vague, they generalize, they talk about the journey instead of the team. Sophie never did that. She talked about value, yes, but never about separation, never about a fresh start, never about needing a new environment. That distinction matters. Then there's the Fever's behavior. Teams don't accidentally keep unsigned players woven into their public identity. That's front office rule number one. You either lean in or you create distance. The Indiana Fever never created distance. If anything, they reinforced belonging. Fans also point to how rare this type of alignment actually is. A player fits the roster, fits the locker room, fits the star, fits the fanbase, and becomes a symbol of toughness for a young team still defining itself. Organizations usually spend years trying to manufacture that kind of cohesion. Walking away from it willingly would be a self-inflicted wound. That's why the accidental leak theory stuck. Not because fans are desperate, but because the logic supports it. When people believe negotiations are heading in a clear direction, they stop guarding their language. They speak casually, they speak forward, they assume the outcome. That's exactly how the podcast moment sounded. And once that door cracked open, fans realized something else. There hasn't been any real pushback, no correction, no clarification from the team, no effort to cool expectations. Silence can mean many things, but in situations like this, it often means alignment behind the scenes. The reality is, nothing about this situation feels adversarial. Money talks are normal. Contract details take time, but the tone surrounding Sophie's future feels settled, even if the paperwork isn't done. That's why this story refuses to die. It isn't fueled by chaos. It's fueled by consistency. Every new detail reinforces the same conclusion instead of contradicting it. And in sports, consistency is usually the loudest signal of all. So when fans say, "This feels done," they're not claiming inside knowledge. They're reading behavior, tone, body language, timing. And history shows that when players and teams quietly move in sync, announcements don't shock anyone. They simply confirm what everyone already felt. Which is why the question has shifted one last time. It's no longer, "Is Sophie coming back?" It's how long before the Fever stop waiting and say it out loud. Nothing official, but everything points one way. At the end of all this, what makes the Sophie Cunningham story so compelling isn't a leaked contract or a confirmed report. It's how predictable the path looks once you step back. No chaos, no mixed signals, just a steady accumulation of clues that all seem to point in the same direction. Nothing has been signed, nothing has been announced, and technically Sophie Cunningham is still a free agent, but this is one of those moments where the absence of news feels louder than any headline. Because when players are truly undecided, or when teams are preparing to move on, the tone changes, the language changes, the energy shifts. None of that has happened here. Instead, what we've seen is continuity. Sophie never distanced herself from the Indiana Fever. The Fever never treated her like a departing piece. Fans never cooled on her. And perhaps most importantly, the chemistry that mattered most, on the court and off it, never disappeared. That kind of alignment doesn't usually dissolve quietly. This also isn't just about fan sentiment. From a basketball standpoint, her role makes sense. From a culture standpoint, her presence makes sense. From a business standpoint, her popularity makes sense. And from a timing standpoint, letting her walk right now would create more questions than answers. That's why the podcast moment hit the way it did. Not because it revealed something shocking, but because it sounded normal, like someone speaking about a future they already assumed was in motion. Those are the moments that tend to be real, not because they're dramatic, but because they're unguarded. Add in the fact that Sophie's rise wasn't accidental. She earned it. She stepped into a moment fans were emotionally invested in, especially when it came to protecting Caitlin Clark, and she didn't flinch. That matters in a league still finding its identity in the spotlight. Free agency is supposed to be about options, but sometimes the best option is the one that's already working. So while the Fever and Sophie still need to agree on numbers, structure, and timing, the bigger picture feels settled. This doesn't look like a breakup waiting to happen. It looks like a pause before confirmation. And that's why fans aren't spiraling anymore. They're waiting. Waiting for the post. Waiting for the announcement. Waiting for the moment when what feels inevitable finally becomes official. Until then, nothing is confirmed. But when every signal keeps lining up, it's usually not coincidence, it's direction. And if history is any guide, the Fever won't surprise anyone when they finally say it out loud.